Coldplay discourse has always been deeply fascinating to me. For the last 20 years, they've stood arguably uncontested as the biggest band in the entire world, with 10 studio albums and at least a dozen globally recognizable hit songs under their belt. At the time of me writing this in late 2024, they're currently the 6th most listened to artist on Spotify worldwide, and over the summer that number was 2 places higher, putting them only behind music industry titans Taylor Swift, Beyonce, and The Weeknd. They've collaborated with just about every superstar on the planet, remained at the top of the Hollywood music industry for a damn near unprecedented amount of time, and have produced quite a few timeless hit songs that are beloved by multiple generations. I mean, show me someone who hates clocks or Viva La Vida, and I'll show you the most miserable person on the planet. With all of this massive success and critical acclaim, you'd expect Coldplay to be one of the most celebrated bands in history, right up there with acts like the Beatles or Michael Jackson. And you'd be dead wrong. Holy shit, would you be dead wrong? Oh my god. You really thought people liked Coldplay? These guys?
Embarrassing!
No, Coldplay are actually one of the most hated bands of all time. There's an entire section of their Wikipedia page dedicated to their position as polarizing musical figures. And if you're a music fan, you probably already know why. Just like Maroon 5, Imagine Dragons, and One Republic, Coldplay have sustained their career over the last 15 years by creating overproduced corporate pop rock, if you want to call it that, devoid of any organic instrumentation or insightful things to say. Like so many other groups of the modern era, interesting riffs and instrumentals are completely thrown to the curbside in favor of layered studio effects and beats. And the songs are written by committees of outside co-writers, all desperately trying to reverse engineer whatever's been trending on the charts as of late. While this strategy has been successful at keeping their brand at the forefront of the Hollywood music industry, it's adversely turned them into the poster boys for bland, uninspired pop rock. Believe it or not, however, things weren't always like this. When Coldplay first got their start in the late 90s, their influences came from highly respected UK alternative bands like Radiohead, Oasis, and U2. This is the version of Coldplay that I fell in love with, as their first 4 albums were chock full of timeless, organic, and lusciously produced indie rock songs. There was truly something special about them during this era. Chris Martin had a seemingly unmatched ability to pump out these beautiful pop melodies that felt like they had always existed, and the rest of the band backed that up with some seriously well thought out and inspired instrumentation. Despite how disliked Coldplay are nowadays, you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody online who seriously hates any of their early records. Their brand of melancholic indie rock may not be your cup of tea per se, but it's hard to deny just how beautiful and well put together their songs were throughout the 2000s. Much like their current status as corporate pop stars, however, things weren't always like this. Believe it or not, society's hatred for Coldplay actually stems all the way back into the heart of their golden age, long before they abandoned making interesting music in the eyes of their current detractors. In fact, many of Coldplay's most classic songs were once written off as cheaply written garbage in the same way that their modern pop hits are. This begs the question, did Coldplay actually change for the worse over time? Or are their old hits just nostalgic to us now? To find out, we need to heed the advice of Chris Martin and take ourselves back to the start. You know, like in the lyrics to The Scientist. Laugh. Laugh at the fuck. Despite what I said earlier, Coldplay hasn't always been a hated band. To be hated, you need to be known. And starting out, they were about as far away from fame as you possibly could be. Frontman Chris Martin, lead guitarist Johnny Buckland, bassist Guy Berryman, and drummer Will Champion all met as friends in college before forming an official band together. But it wouldn't take long for these British lads Fuck, why did I just do that? Okay, anyway. To realize their shared love for creating music. Chris Martin specifically was known around campus for his ability to write catchy songs on the spot about his friends and classmates. And once he and Johnny started writing some tunes together, everything started falling into place. Within a few months, Guy and Will would officially join the lineup. And after going through a few, questionable names, Coldplay was eventually born. It was clear from the get-go that Coldplay had a special sauce to them that made them stand out from the rest of the pack, as Chris Martin's songwriting craft and singing abilities were already a cut above many of their established contemporaries, even before officially recording anything. On top of that, Johnny, Guy, and Will all perfectly complemented him as instrumentalists. The four of them just had this insane chemistry together that usually takes bands years of trial and error to figure out, and that chemistry was on full display even in their earliest recordings. Between 1998 and 1999, Coldplay would release 3 EPs, or miniature albums, in the hopes of getting signed to a record label. It would soon get the attention of EMI's Parlophone Records, home to world-famous British acts like the Beatles and Radiohead, and from there, the rest is history. Contrary to their overproduced pop style of today, early Coldplay were known for their raw, intimate, and moody lo-fi rock sound. Songs were built around Chris Martin singing and playing acoustic guitar, and then fleshed out with some electric guitar leads from Johnny, driving melodic bass lines from Guy, and simple yet highly effective rock drumming from Will. Just an overall clean-cut and classic-sounding British rock style that, while a bit derivative from their idol band Radiohead, did anyone else just hear that? Absolutely held the songwriting chops necessary to back such a comparison up. It's normal for bands to wear their influences on their sleeves when just starting out. But luckily it wouldn't take Coldplay long at all to develop their own style. Even before their debut album Parachutes would release on July 10th, 2000, Coldplay were already building a massive amount of hype around themselves. Their debut single Shiver did relatively well in the UK, but it was the record's second single, Yellow, that blew up into an international hit and put Coldplay on the map. Even now, a quarter of a century later, Yellow remains a classic song within the realm of pop culture, still just as relevant with modern audiences as it ever was. Its Radiohead-esque electric guitars paired with a mellow vibe and melancholic lyrics made for such a beautiful, captivating song, one that really showed what Coldplay were capable of right out of the gate. On top of that, the band were quickly proving themselves to be a phenomenal live act as well, which only furthered the hype around them. It was clear that Coldplay were the real deal, and Parachute's release all but confirmed that they had the sauce. Seriously, this entire project is so well thought out, so meticulously crafted, and so damn well written. Every single song feels like it has the same amount of love, care, and attention put into it. While they were definitely still wearing their Radiohead influences on their sleeve at this point, they had also begun to incorporate influences from American folk singer Jeff Buckley. This caused Coldplay's sound to evolve into a much more mellow and laid-back indie rock singer-songwriter vibe. The songs on here are very low-key and acoustic-driven with mostly softer drum rhythms, and a very contemplative, emotive sound compared to their early EPs. The best way I can describe it is like listening to a local band perform at a small, intimate coffee shop. But like if that band were actually good. Well, I think they were good, but already at this point, we were starting to see the tides turn against Coldplay's favor in certain music circles. While reception around the group was overwhelmingly positive at this point, especially in the UK, there was this growing sentiment within the indie rock community that they were gaining popularity a little too fast. Some music snobs began to accuse the band of being industry plants and hacks, or as Chris Martin put it,
like some sort of indie boy band.
Their role as a softer, more accessible clone of Radiohead wasn't doing their indie cred any favors either. That being said, Coldplay weren't too famous yet to the point where the masses could genuinely get worked up about them. In the grand scheme of things, their social capital was still small enough to where they very easily could have wound up as one-hit wonders, and the band definitely knew this too. When it came time to write a follow-up album, they doubted their abilities to recapture the magic of Parachutes, and quickly became stricken with perfectionism. Then 9/11 fucking happened. I'm not joking here. 9/11 had a serious impact on Coldplay's next album, 2002's A Rush of Blood to the Head. The band quickly realized the urgency of the current moment, and began to rapidly work on the record as if it were the last chance that they'd ever have to make music together. This sense of urgency, as well as an intense drive to prove themselves to the music snobs who wrote them off as industry plants, resulted in one of the most acclaimed albums of the 21st century so far. A Rush of Blood to the Head took the foundation they had built with Parachutes and injected it with a huge syringe of steroids that beefed up their sound. They still had a mellow, intimate, and contemplative vibe, but now the songs were being driven by hard-hitting rock drums, U2-esque electric guitars, and most importantly, the piano, an instrument that was used sparingly up to this point, but was now a driving factor of their sound. This is the album where Coldplay became Coldplay, and their various influences blended together into something new and unique. It's also the record that blew them up into mainstream titans. It scored 2 more international hit songs in the form of Clocks and The Scientist, which, like Yellow, have stood the test of time and are just as relevant decades later. On top of that, the album won 3 separate Grammys and was one of the biggest releases of 2002. They had now beaten the one-hit wonder and one album wonder allegations, and in just a few short years attained a career that most bands could only dream of. I mean, 2 massive albums and a couple of hits are basically all Oasis ever achieved, and they're still considered one of the largest British rock bands in history. Coldplay had now established themselves as one of the biggest global forces in music. And that right there is where it all went wrong. You see, while Coldplay did receive some pushback during these early years from the indie rock community, they were by no means a hated band like they're known for being today. Both Parachutes and A Rush of Blood to the Head received critical acclaim and commercial success at the time, and even today are looked back on fondly as some of the best alt-rock records of the early 2000s. By the middle of the decade, however, the tides were starting to shift. Coldplay began touring the United States during this time and very quickly began rising the ranks of the Hollywood music industry. But while their sound was highly praised back at home in the UK, the American music scene was not exactly receptive to their brand of clean-cut British alt-rock. This was the era of nu metal, garage rock, and pop punk, and Coldplay just simply did not fit in with bands like Limp Bizkit or Blink-182. They were just seen as too soft, too mellow, and too British. Ugh. To really be taken seriously by the rock community over here. But perhaps most damningly to their credibility was when Chris Martin started to become a mainstream celebrity. The once unknown college kid was now a bona fide rock star, fronting one of the biggest bands in the entire world. In 2003, he would marry A-list celebrity Gwyneth Paltrow, a move that further damaged the band's already shaky indie cred. Yellow made Chris Martin famous, but A Rush of Blood to the Head made him into a household name of celebrity culture. All of this put an easy target on Coldplay's back, and the pressures of fame and fortune would soon begin to crack at their foundation. This all came to a head during the recording of their 3rd studio album in 2005, X and Y. This was the first Coldplay project to be recorded after their rise to global superstardom, and both the critics and the band members themselves knew that this was going to be a defining moment in their legacy. Would they be able to keep the train rolling, or would they finally be exposed as indie rock flukes? Wait, why am I asking you this? In contrast to their previous album, which was defined by raw urgency, X and Y was defined by debilitating perfectionism. Recording sessions for the record have been widely documented as one of the most difficult periods in the band's entire history, seeing as it was the first time that they truly had to grapple with their newfound global fame. Tensions between members were extremely high, and no matter what they tried, they just couldn't get results that they were happy with. Near-finished versions of the album were completely scrapped on 2 separate occasions, and even the final version that we have today infamously left the band dissatisfied. After numerous delays, X and Y finally hit store shelves in June of 2005, and reception was not great. It was not very good. Now look, I'm gonna get ahead of things here and say that I think X and Y is a fantastic record full of some of Coldplay's best songs, period. And over time, it has garnered a reputation as one of their greatest albums. It's truly a fan favorite nowadays, but in the context of the time, I get why there was pushback. A Rush of Blood to the Head was one of those rare masterpiece albums where every single song was not only outstandingly well written, but also unique. Each track filled its own distinct musical universe, but there was still a unified artistic vision that kept the sound feeling cohesive throughout. It showed that Coldplay were a band with massive potential, but X and Y kind of exposed that potential as having already been fulfilled. Whereas A Rush of Blood to the Head felt like a creative breakthrough, X and Y, on the other hand, kind of felt like creative stagnation. While the songs were just as great as ever, and I do mean that, you kind of get the feeling after listening to it that there was really nowhere else for the Coldplay sound to go from here. That isn't to say there was no musical evolution here, of course. X and Y saw Coldplay at their heaviest alt-rock sound yet, and the use of the Yamaha CS80 synth on every track gave the album an outer space-like feel that wasn't present on their first two records. Still, these minor differences weren't enough to stop critics from cynically viewing the album as a rehash of previous work from a band that had undeservedly grown too popular too fast. Where things really took a turn for the worse, however, was when the New York Times published a now infamous article titled "The Case Against Coldplay." This piece hammered home the idea that Coldplay were a lame pop band stealing the sound of Radiohead, Pink Floyd, and the Beatles and dumbing it down for the radio-listening masses. This sentiment was only reinforced later in the year when a massive new comedy movie you may have heard of, The 40-Year-Old Virgin, had this to say on the matter.
You know how I know you're gay?
How?
You like Coldplay.
For context, back in 2005, this was an insult and not a compliment. The middling reviews of X and Y, combined with these cultural hit pieces, cemented Coldplay's legacy as one of the lamest bands on the planet. But on the other side of that coin, it also cemented Coldplay's place as perhaps the biggest band in the entire world. To say that X and Y was a massive success would be an understatement. Not only was it one of the best-selling albums of 2005, but it also spawned two more international hit songs in the form of Speed of Sound and Fix You. Speed of Sound specifically was Coldplay's biggest song to date at this point, even though nowadays it's probably the least remembered of their early hits. Fix You, on the other hand, only grew in popularity over the decades, eventually becoming one of their main signature songs. The X and Y album cycle thrust Coldplay into the discussion as potentially the biggest band in the world at that moment, and that sentiment was only proven correct during their massive stadium tour in support of the record. Up until this point, Coldplay had mainly performed at smaller venues and theaters, only really dipping their toes into stadiums and arenas towards the end of the A Rush of Blood to the Head tour. As a result, X and Y was still written with the band's more intimate songwriting philosophy in mind, but the X and Y Twisted Logic tour saw them developing a true live show with a consistent setlist each night, half a dozen or so mega hits to perform, pyrotechnics, and spectacles galore. This tour began to mold Coldplay into a stadium rock group, a shift that would have an effect on all future records. And it was around this time that we started to see the early symptoms of Coldplay's fame alienating their hardcore fan base. Looking at old internet forums from around this time, many fans felt a lack of intimacy with the band during this era, missing the smaller scaled shows with more spontaneous setlists each night. These contentions would only grow moving forward. By the time the 2000s began to draw to a close, Chris Martin's hunger to prove the critics wrong had reached a breaking point. While they had become the world's biggest rock band, the middling reviews of X and Y left Coldplay in a bit of a dangerous spot. They knew that if they messed this next project up, their dreams of Radiohead-esque critical acclaim might slip them by. In the words of Chris Martin, "We can't get any bigger, so we're gonna have to get better." To record their fourth studio album, Viva La Vida or Death and All His Friends, the band brought on legendary producer Brian Eno to help spice up their sound, and spice things up he did. Brian opened up Chris's mind to start having fun with music again without worrying about getting good reviews or seeming cool. And just like that, all of the perfectionism issues that plagued the recording of X and Y simply melted away. Viva La Vida was the first Coldplay album to be recorded specifically with a live stadium tour in mind, but unlike the albums that followed it, these live show ambitions didn't get in the way of their desire to create musically rich and creative songs. This hybrid of where Coldplay started and where they'd soon be heading resulted in what many consider to be their best album, and I'm right there in that boat as well. Viva La Vida saw Coldplay at their creative peak, taking their original mellow indie rock style and evolving that into a much more expansive Beatles-y art rock sound. While the songs were still built around the band organically performing their core instruments together, each track now featured a much wider variety of instrumentation than ever before, ranging between soaring string sections, tack pianos, organs, and world instruments like santors and tablas. Even more so than a rush of blood to the head, Viva La Vida or Death and All His Friends is one of those rare albums where every track feels completely distinct from the last, without sacrificing a creative through line that ties everything together sonically. Each of these songs feel like they belong to the same family, but there was clearly an explosion of creativity coming out of the studio that blew anything they had made previously out of the water. Johnny's guitar riffs featured a wider array of effects than on previous records, and he was given room to create stunning guitar solos on most tracks. Will's drumming felt more complex and diverse than ever before, with songs like Lovers in Japan stacking several drum tracks on top of each other to create syncopated rhythms. Combine that with Guy's phenomenal bass playing, and this might be Coldplay's tightest album rhythmically. Chris's sense of melody peaked here as well, as did his lyricism. I know Coldplay don't have a reputation for deep poetry or anything, but this might be the one album where they truly knocked it out of the park in that regard. The lyrics on these songs paint such vivid imagery, tackling complex topics like war, revolution, religion, and death in a way that we sadly would rarely ever see again. Viva La Vida or Death and All of His Friends was released to both massive critical acclaim and commercial success, and while it only spawned one new international hit, that hit was by far the biggest of their career up to this point. I'm of course talking about the title track, Viva La Vida, a soaring orchestral ballad that eschews typical rock band instrumentation in favor of sweeping string arrangements and church bells. Of course, you don't need me to describe it to you. You've likely already heard it hundreds of times in your life. That said, it was a very different sound for Coldplay, even compared to the rest of the album. Many fans wondered how they were even gonna perform it live, a concern that really applied to most of the record given how expansive the instrumental palette was on this project. This question would be answered when Coldplay embarked on their largest stadium run yet, the Viva La Vida tour. Where the Twisted Logic tour was Coldplay's first attempt at a highly curated live show, this new tour saw the group pushing the limits of their rock band identity. This was where we saw Coldplay's live performances begin to evolve into more of a pop act than a rock one, with heavier usage of backing tracks and the focus shifting more onto Chris Martin as a solo performer rather than Coldplay as a band. Between acoustic sets, Chris solo on the piano, the varied stage setups needed to play songs like Viva La Vida, and a bizarre attempt to reinterpret some of their older songs as dance tracks with Will pounding away on a drum machine, it felt like Coldplay only spent a fraction of the show actually performing in their traditional rock band setup. If the recording sessions for this album didn't already begin to shift Coldplay's approach to writing music, then this new experimental approach to their live act definitely did. Going into 2011, Coldplay were now without a doubt the biggest band in the entire world, coming off of 4 massively successful albums with at least a half dozen or so international hit songs under their belt. On top of that, they had finally proven all of the critics wrong. While X and Y and even their first 2 records had their fair share of detractors, both the Viva La Vida album and song were acclaimed by pretty much everyone. For a brief few years, it really did seem like Coldplay were going to be able to have their cake and eat it too, where they could be both massively famous and successful while still being critically respected. Unfortunately, however, this prosperity would not last for very long. When it came time to record a follow-up, Coldplay were faced with an existential crisis. How do you top an album like Viva La Vida? Was it even possible? Sure, they could ride the success of it for a little while, but eventually they were going to have to record new music. And this time, things were going to be much, much different. To understand this pivotal moment in Coldplay's evolution, we have to go back and catch up with what had been going on in the American music industry over the last couple of years. Shortly after Viva La Vida's release in 2008, the United States underwent a infamous financial crisis that crippled the economy and left everyday citizens on the brink of homelessness. This crisis led to a trend within the music industry that's been retroactively dubbed recession pop. The millennial youth didn't want to listen to dad rock music or angry punk songs anymore. The world was already depressing enough. Instead, they turned to the club scene to forget about their daily issues, and thus saw the rise of danceable club songs from rising stars like Kesha, Pitbull, and the Black Eyed Peas completely saturating the charts. This wave of recession pop caused traditional rock music, a genre that had enjoyed a half-century of consistent lucrative success, to completely die out in the mainstream within a matter of just 2 to 3 years. Hey, Editing Greg here. I just wanted to clarify that recession pop wasn't the only thing that killed rock music. It had been in decline since the 90s for a variety of complicated reasons. The rise of recession pop was just the final nail in the coffin. One could easily argue that the only reason Viva La Vida managed to become such a massive hit was because it lacked electric guitars or heavy rock drumming. And this left the world's biggest rock band in a bit of a precarious situation. Coldplay were faced with topping a once-in-a-career masterpiece album in a musical landscape that wasn't going to care even if they did top it. Not only did they have no financial incentive to try, but they lacked an artistic incentive as well. They had been at the top of the Hollywood music industry for 2 album cycles now with no competition, and had won the critical respect they had pined after for so many years. With nothing left to prove, their artistic drive naturally fizzled out. Coldplay's first attempts at following up Viva La Vida started in late 2008. When the band began to work on a stripped-down, back-to-basics record known as The Wedding Album. Not too much about this project is documented, but we do know that the band were struggling to find a new direction forward. The album was supposed to come out in late 2009, but was delayed to late 2010 before being scrapped altogether in early 2011. And I firmly believe that something changed inside Chris Martin during those 3 years. He had lived the life of a Hollywood A-list celebrity for nearly a decade by this point, now palling around with billionaire influencers like Jay-Z and Beyonce. And after a certain amount of time living this lifestyle, you start to lose your connection to the average person. I think that around the turn of the decade, Chris became too complacent in his own success, and began to lose his ability to relate to the working man. He just wasn't able to write serious alternative songs anymore. Everything coming out of his mind was stadium-sized and inspired by the American pop scene. And so, the music followed. It should be of no surprise then, of course, that Coldplay's true 5th studio album, Milo Xyloto, saw the band completely sell out to the Hollywood music industry. At least in the eyes of their detractors, don't sue me. Right from the album's lead single, Every Teardrop is a Waterfall, it was clear that the original vision for what Coldplay was had died sometime in between 2008 and 2011. The song was noticeably overproduced, washed with pulsating club synthesizers, compression, studio effects, and all sorts of filters over Chris's voice. Will's drumming was reduced to nothing more than a kick drum dance beat for a majority of the runtime, Guy's bass guitar is nowhere to be heard, and while Johnny has a pretty great poppy guitar riff that gives the song some life, it's pretty much the only recognizably Coldplay element here. Even more jarringly, the lyrics are painfully simple even for Coldplay standards. It reads more like a 2011 Miley Cyrus song than anything Chris Martin would normally write. Well, up to this point anyways. Now, that's not to say that this shift towards bubblegum pop makes it an automatically bad song. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and that goes for literally everything Coldplay would release from here on out, okay? Do you hear me? If you like pop Coldplay, that's great and valid. But this shift in direction undeniably destroyed any remaining rock credibility that they had left. The promotional cycle leading up to Milo Xyloto's release devastated Coldplay's original fanbase, which at this point still mostly consisted of indie rock fans who were constantly defending the band from their own scene. In their eyes, Coldplay had suddenly become the band that the haters always said they were. A corporate pop group releasing shallow songs to play in the background of your local JCPenney. Just like that, any critical respect that they had won with Viva La Vida had now gone right out the window, and Coldplay were back to being the world's biggest punching bag. Now, of course, the question remains. Was this fair? Or was this just another case of pretentious indie heads being too stubborn to enjoy accessible pop music? Well, as a shameless fan of early Coldplay, I have to be honest with my opinions here and say that I think this album falls incredibly flat compared to anything they had released before. In fact, I don't even really think it's close. While the project was once again produced by Brian Eno, now credited as an outside co-writer on every single track, the results couldn't be further away from their last collaboration together, where every song on Viva La Vida stood out as its own creative universe. Milo Xyloto's 14 tracks all blend together into a sludgy mush of oversaturated colors. And to be honest, to me at least, it feels like only half of them had actual effort put in. This is just my opinion, of course. Put the pitchforks down. I see them. I see you getting them out. But I will say that I'm far from the only fan that feels this way. The half of the album that works for me on some level follows the bubblegum pop rock formula set up by the lead single. You know, simple lyrics, kick drum dance beats, club synthesizers, vocal filters, studio effects, the works. I will be nice and say that these songs are actually pretty good for what they are. It still takes talent to write catchy pop music, and if that's what you're in the market for, then hey, some of these songs are pretty peak. Still, they just feel like such a far cry from what Coldplay were before this point. Their first 4 albums were so timeless, but Milo Xyloto's sound feels completely dated to 2011. Nowhere is this more obvious than on Princess of China featuring Rihanna, Coldplay's first overt pop song with no rock elements at all. It's also Coldplay's first true collaboration, as before this point they prided themselves on writing and performing everything on their own as an actual band. Princess of China can best be described as a 2011 Rihanna single featuring Chris Martin. It sounds absolutely nothing like a Coldplay song and doesn't feature the other members at all, at least as far as I can tell. The remaining 6 pop songs may be way too overproduced, but they at least on some level try to sound like a band. As for the remaining 7 songs, to me they feel completely phoned in. 3 of them are short ambient interludes that really add nothing to the album other than artificially inflating the track list. The remaining 4 tracks, however, are all stripped back Chris Martin solo songs with little to no additions from the rest of the band. Just Chris on piano or Chris on acoustic guitar. Now, these types of stripped back Chris solo songs have existed in Coldplay's discography as far back as their early EPs from the 90s, but they were always used sparingly and usually as B-sides that didn't even make the cut on the record. Here, however, half of the album straight up just doesn't feature the rest of Coldplay, or at least does so very minimally, with the interlude tracks not even featuring Chris Martin. Maybe this would be okay if the other half of the album wasn't so overproduced that the rest of the band being featured rings hollow, but what really grinds my gears about these Chris solo tracks, however, is that in my opinion at least, they're dreadfully boring. Seriously, I've listened to this album multiple times throughout my life, and I could not tell you how any of these filler songs go except like, maybe Up in Flames? Just in one ear and out the other, as if Chris Martin suddenly forgot how to write compelling lyrics and melodies. Something he used to be able to do seemingly effortlessly up through Viva La Vida, even on the B-sides. When you go back to older Chris solo songs, even just from the Viva era, the amount of emotion, passion, and heart that went into them is night and day compared to how boring and lullaby-like the Milo ones are. In my opinion, they really do drag down what would otherwise be a pretty solid mainstream pop album. While Milo Xyloto completely alienated Coldplay's initial fan base and destroyed any indie rock credibility that they had left, It did exactly what they set out for it to do: maintain their position as the biggest band in the entire world. Any hardcore fans leaving were immediately replaced with an even bigger fan base of radio listeners, who fully embraced their new direction with open arms. Milo introduced a whole slew of new international hits into their roster, most notable of which being Paradise, which is kind of a banger song, I'm not gonna lie. Every Teardrop is a Waterfall and Princess of China were both pretty big hits as well, but neither really managed to stand the test of time in the same way that Paradise managed to. Still, the success of those three singles helped Coldplay safely transition into the next phase of their career, where the focus shifted away from crafting well-thought-out albums and towards producing mainstream pop hits in order to fill out arenas. Speaking of, if the Milo Xyloto album didn't solidify Coldplay's change in direction, the Milo Xyloto live show certainly did. This was where their concerts became more about style over substance, with an increased use of backing tracks, gimmicks, fireworks, and glow bands, and a decrease in Chris playing instruments so that he can strut down the arena's massive catwalk into the audience. This was a huge success for them though, and through the years their live shows have only grown more and more grandiose and pop-oriented. Not to get too ahead of ourselves, but their current tours feel more like live raves than they do a rock concert. While Coldplay may have lost their critical respect, they in turn became even more popular than ever before. Throughout the remainder of the 2010s, Coldplay would continue to dominate pop radio with a series of hit singles that increasingly chased after whatever dated trends were popular at the time. In 2014, there was A Sky Full of Stars, an Avicii-produced EDM song that, while admittedly kind of a slapper, did nothing to help Coldplay's perception as, you know, sellouts. In 2015, we saw them chase the disco pop trend with Adventure of a Lifetime, which was surprisingly another really good pop song, but it was overshadowed that same year by Him for the Weekend featuring Beyonce, which wasn't as good in my opinion. It's not awful, but like Princess of China before it, it sounds more like a Beyonce song featuring Chris Martin than the other way around. And the lyrics about getting drunk and high are so un-Coldplay-like that it's almost laughable. Finally, to close out the decade, they had a big EDM collaboration with the Chainsmokers. You know, the Chainsmokers. Remember the Chainsmokers? Yeah, this is Coldplay's biggest song on Spotify, even though it technically isn't even theirs. And to a lot of people, it reeked of their desperation to remain relevant. By this point, Coldplay had fully transformed into a mainstream pop group, like Maroon 5, Imagine Dragons, or One Republic. Chris Martin was now living in LA full-time, actively promoting Coldplay as a pop band in interviews to erase the idea that they were ever a rock band to begin with. While I do think Coldplay's pop singles were much better than what their contemporaries were putting out at the time, that right there is the issue. They were now a more tolerable Maroon 5 instead of a less complex Radiohead, and that shift right there caused something interesting to happen in the background. All of the hatred towards Coldplay was now directed at their current trend-chasing mainstream pop hits, and as the Radiohead comparisons melted away, people began to appreciate their first 4 albums for what they were. They were now seen as a band that used to be great instead of a band that just, you know, wasn't great. But again, was this fair? Coldplay's old hits were hated on for being too mainstream before people came around on them, so who's to say that that wasn't still the case during the 2010s? In fact, if you were to look just a little deeper under the surface, you'd pretty quickly realize that Coldplay's output during this time was a fair bit more interesting than what the general public gave them credit for. Do you remember that EDM song from 2014 that I mentioned earlier, A Sky Full of Stars? Well, the album that came from, Ghost Stories, actually sounds nothing like it. It was simply a radio hit grafted on to what was otherwise a more intimate and alternative-leaning indie-tronica record. Chris's celebrity divorce with Gwyneth Paltrow forced him to reconvene with his raw, emotive songwriting roots. And while I wouldn't say it's nearly as good as their first 4 albums, it's definitely a bit more inspired and creative than the big EDM single would have you believe. While 2015's A Head Full of Dreams was a return to phone consumed in mainstream pop, a companion piece known as the Kaleidoscope EP was released alongside it, which featured a few tracks that harkened back to Coldplay's original indie rock style. Also, remember that EDM collaboration with the Chainsmokers? Well, that actually didn't close out the decade for them at all. In 2019, Coldplay would put out their 8th studio record, Everyday Life, a release that really took the fan base by surprise, being a 16-track double album not meant for mainstream radio in the slightest. Instead, Everyday Life was a return to a more stripped down and raw sound with inspired songs about complex world issues like war, gun violence, terrorism, genocide, and poverty. Chris had once again found genuine inspiration after firsthand witnessing the conditions in Palestine and Jordan. And while it was still more of a Chris solo record than a full band effort due to being perhaps a little too stripped back, it at least felt like Chris had something real to say about the world again. Considering that they had just spent the last 3 album cycles chasing trends on pop radio, this really felt like a signal to fans that those days were over and we could finally get back to the original vision of what Coldplay was supposed to be. That didn't happen, but you know, we had hope. Unfortunately, Everyday Life's uncommercial nature led it to fail at producing any type of hit for the first time in the band's career. And so just like the Kaleidoscope EP, or the rest of Ghost Stories minus A Sky Full of Stars, this project just straight up didn't exist to anybody outside of Coldplay's already loyal hardcore fanbase. In the eyes of the general public, the last thing that they did was collaborate with a flash-in-the-pan EDM act that nobody seemed to really like. And that was on top of a string of already extremely mainstream trend-chasing singles and albums that destroyed any artistic credibility that they may have once held. Up until this point in their discography, I was always willing to defend Coldplay when people were taking the piss out of them. Their first 4 albums were timeless classics chock full of amazing songs, and while their shift towards mainstream bubblegum pop was disappointing to say the least, they were pulling it off honestly pretty well and still teasing fans with more alternative-leaning projects and songs. The problem is that you'd already have to be an active Coldplay fan to understand that, and it was really hard for fans to continuously run damage control on their legacy when to the general public all it seemed like they were doing was desperately chasing trend after trend. While Everyday Life could have been the start of a new phase of Coldplay's career where they focused on art and experimentalism over commercial success, that didn't happen. That didn't even come close to happening. They would instead pivot back to mainstream pop harder than ever before, with their most recent 2 albums going full-blown Maroon 5 levels of desperation. Unlike Everyday Life, however, the general public would bear full witness to what was essentially the final nail in their legacy's coffin. 2021's Music of the Spheres is often regarded by both fans and critics alike as Coldplay's worst album, and in my opinion, it marked the point of no return for the band to ever be respected outside of their core fanbase ever again. It saw the group at their most overproduced and least inspired yet, in no due part thanks to the involvement of the project's lead producer, Max Martin. For the uninitiated, Max Martin is one of the most prolific pop songwriters of all time, writing and producing countless #1 hits in the US over the last 30 years. From the Backstreet Boys and Britney Spears, to Katy Perry and Usher, to Ariana Grande and The Weeknd, Max Martin has not stopped writing blockbuster songs. He's essentially the man directly responsible for the rise of bubblegum pop in the mid to late 90s. And now, coming off of the success of The Weeknd's smash hit #1 single Blinding Lights, here he was to lead Coldplay back onto the charts. With a rehash of that formula. Fuck. The album's lead single, Higher Power, was an aggressively mainstream and pop-oriented number that could best be described as Blinding Lights 2. But you know, whiter. Coldplay undeniably do not have the coolness factor that The Weeknd does, or did, to pull off this slick synth-pop style with any sort of flair, and so it basically just comes off as Blinding Lights at home. The song was a big charting success for them, their first since the Chainsmokers collab, but all it did was reinforce to the haters that Coldplay were nothing more than trend-chasing industry hacks. The real damage, however, was done by the album's true hit single, My Universe, featuring the K-pop boy band BTS. The song went #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, their first to do so since 2008's Viva La Vida, but it's safe to say that it didn't garner nearly the same amount of respect. Or any. My Universe was a hit in the same way that Imagine Dragons' Thunder and Maroon 5 Girls Like You were hits, in that they were heavily supported by retail store playlists and corporate radio, but hated by pretty much anybody who listens to music outside of those settings. As for the rest of the album, the full project was far more polarizing than a lot of fans were anticipating. For starters, underdeveloped filler absolutely plagues this thing. Of the album's 12 songs, 3 of them are short ambient interludes, 1 is an a cappella hymn featuring Jacob Collier and R&B duo We Are King, and 1 is a rave instrumental provided by electronic musician John Hopkins. That leaves only 7 fully fledged verse-chorus songs to dig into, all of which are way glossier and more overproduced than ever before, with extremely simple and corny lyrics to boot. Most of these are just bland bubblegum pop songs, but there are a few real stinkers on here that are bad in kind of a surprising way. Beautiful, for example, is a painfully basic acoustic pop track sung by an alien puppet character named Angel Moon, who has a chipmunked voice that sounds like Elmo from Sesame Street. People of the Pride, on the other hand, took a promising old Viva La Vida demo and Max Martinified it into Ford F-150 stock music slop. Finally, Let Somebody Go featuring Selena Gomez is another case like Princess of China or Hymn for the Weekend, where it sounds more like a Selena Gomez song featuring Chris Martin than the other way around. It even has her writing and production team on it. Speaking of, the songwriting credits are consistently littered with outside co-writers of the Hollywood industry variety, averaging about 4 per track if we're being generous. This was a problem that really started on their 2015 album A Head Full of Dreams, where Coldplay teamed up with pop duo Stargate to produce the record and co-write every single song on it. Still, like Milo Xyloto before it with Brian Eno, Stargate were the only outside co-writers credited on any given track. Things actually got worse on Everyday Life, where the floodgates truly opened for the first time in that regard. Still, most of the outside co-writers on that album were genuine respected musicians from around the world, like Nigerian Afrobeat pioneer Femi Kuti or jazz composer Alice Coltrane. On top of that, there were still a number of songs that were solely written by Coldplay alone. Here, however, the gloves were finally off. A bunch of Hollywood super producers absolutely flooded the creative process in the same way as later Maroon 5 albums. There is one genuinely good song on this album in my opinion, and it's the 10-minute long closing track Coloratura. This is the one piece on the record not produced by Max Martin. And you can tell. Besides the 10-minute runtime giving it away, it's entirely organic in instrumentation with flowing pianos, drums, bass guitar, string arrangements, harmonies, and even a guitar solo from Johnny, who's been increasingly absent on recent albums. As good as it is though, again, the general public has no idea that it exists. What they do know is Higher Power and My Universe featuring BTS. That and the album getting negative reviews from mainstream critics across the board. Max Martin may be a genius bubblegum pop songwriter, but his tight-knit formula for generating radio hits unfortunately sucked out any remaining soul that Coldplay had left. It's clear that by this point, the band were more concerned with putting on massive EDM rave shows every night for their sold-out arena audiences, rather than writing genuine, heartfelt music for the listeners back home. It's a trajectory that Coldplay had been on since the X and Y Twisted Logic tour, but didn't start negatively affecting their musical output until Milo Xyloto. Music of the Spheres represents the logical conclusion to this progression, a record created for their live show and live show only, with very little to latch onto outside of that rare setting. Every track except for Coloratura is either an interlude intended for the show, or an extremely simple pop song that millions of people can sing along to no matter where they're from or what language they speak. Now, this global pop star approach isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think that Chris Martin's goal of trying to unite people around the world under the guise of love and unity is a noble one. But like I've said in previous videos, when you set out to make art that appeals to absolutely everybody, you end up making an incredibly safe, sterile, and boring product that doesn't get much critical respect. Despite its artistic shortcomings, however, Music of the Spheres was a massive commercial success for Coldplay. They clawed their way back onto the map with 2 more mega hits, and their current Music of the Spheres live show is one of the highest grossing tours in history, still ongoing to this day, by the way. Unfortunately though, now over 2 decades into their career, this represented Coldplay's last chance to make any sort of impact on their legacy. It seems that as of now, their time as mainstream hitmakers has fully come to an end. The band's most recent album, 2024's Moon Music, failed to generate any real hits for the second time in their career. Unlike Everyday Life, however, which wasn't intending to be mainstream, Moon Music definitely was. The project was directly promoted as Music of the Spheres Part 2, once again produced by Max Martin and absolutely smothered by outside co-writers and collabs with relevant pop stars and rappers. The entire record feels like Chris and Max Martin throwing random genres and ideas at the wall for 40 minutes, trying desperately to get something to stick. From trap songs to club bangers to soft rock ballads. It results in a very incohesive record that doesn't reach the strange lows of Music of the Spheres, thank God there's no puppet songs on here, but is a much more boring and empty experience in my opinion. The lyrics are simpler and cornier than ever, with pretty much every single song being about love from the most surface level viewpoint. Chris has absolutely nothing to say about love on here other than love good. And you can tell as literally every song is stuffed with la 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 lyrics to pad out the runtime. This was an issue that started creeping in after they first went mainstream pop in the early 2010s, but started getting really bad once Max Martin stepped into the picture. Here, however, the problem has reached rock bottom. Moon Music wasn't a complete failure or anything. They're still one of the most listened to artists globally and are raking in mad cash from the continued Music of the Spheres World Tour, but it marked a point that comes for every massive act where you can't get a pop hit to chart even with the entirety of the Hollywood music industry standing behind you. It's been 25 years since Coldplay's first big hit with Yellow, and no matter how big and famous you are, no pop career really lasts beyond that point. Coldplay seem to know this too, as recent interviews with Chris Martin have indicated that their recording career is coming to an end. Their last mark on pop culture will very likely be My Universe featuring BTS, and while the song is inoffensive and does have its fans, surprisingly, it unfortunately showed the general public that Coldplay were a band willing to do anything to get a hit. So why do people hate Coldplay? Well, as you can tell from my last hour of rambling, it's complicated. They were always an uncool band due to their popularity and softer sound, even back when they were writing genuine timeless classics. And while the power of hindsight has retroactively showered their early records with critical acclaim, they sullied their legacy by selling out right when people were starting to come around on them. All of the music snobs from the early 2000s were validated when Coldplay proved them correct. And so that negative cultural view of the band only became more and more reinforced as they continue to churn out increasingly uninspired pop hits. Now, is this legacy fair? Well, yes and no. Music is subjective, and while I've been quite harsh on their post-Viva La Vida material, clearly a lot of people love what they're doing. If that wasn't the case, then the Music of the Spheres tour wouldn't be breaking records and selling out arenas night after night. That said, when you go from making detailed and nuanced indie rock music to Adam Levine levels of uninspired pop, you can't be surprised when you start to turn audiences against you. I'm not opposed to change or evolution. For a band to continue on for so long, it's necessary. Viva La Vida proved that Coldplay could evolve in a way that was musically challenging and in line with the band's original vision, but future records mostly abandoned this trajectory in order to chase whatever sounds were trending at the time. Considering the band's global popularity and Chris Martin's induction into the Hollywood celebrity lifestyle, perhaps this decline was inevitable. Once Chris started making millions of dollars, It was really only a matter of time before commercial success began to outweigh genuine artistry in terms of importance. Still, if Coldplay's pop hits make people happy, then they deserve to exist in the world. It's just not going to change the minds of music snobs like myself, who yearn for their once detailed, intimate, and musically rich indie rock records. While Coldplay aren't done releasing new albums, their time in the mainstream has decidedly come to an end. Their misses will eventually fade away, while their classics continue to live on through future generations. Perhaps one day, decades down the line, Coldplay's legacy will heal itself once more. Hey everyone! Thanks for watching, and thank you to my patrons for continuously supporting my channel. If you have more time to waste, I've got 2 more pop culture video essays linked directly in front of you for your viewing pleasure, with plenty more coming down the pipeline. Until then, I've been GregCubed, and I'll see you next time.